to make you do more. But
Right.
yeah,
Right.
but yeah, no,
Do
thankfully,
do you actually have to deal with COVID patients?
no,
No.
not at all. But at least for now, I think this is hopefully it'll change by the time in the next few weeks. But we deal with usually it's just cancer patients.
Right.
Because all the regular medicine doctor internists are dealing with COVID patients, we're covering some of the non-cancer medicine patients.
Okay.
I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just a figurehead. I'm just here for
Hopefully you do know what you're doing.
I know who to ask. That's what I know. That's the important part.
Yeah.
You know who to ask. Okay, we'll wait for our crowd.
Yeah. And three's a crowd.
Okay, so we can get started. Not such a long daf, so we should be okay. So today's daf, start slowly. I'm sure Hanan's joining, is daf Tzadi Bet. There we go. On clockwork, right? Tzadi Bet 92. And we got to the Mishnah all the way in the bottom of Tzadi Aleph Amud Bet at 2 lines from the bottom. So the Mishnah, remember the previous Mishnah mentioned an onain was one of the people who you can be shochet a carbon Pesach for, but not if it's a group that's just oninim, right? And we said, at least I said, I don't think we spoke it out too much yesterday, that Rashi explains, the Gemara doesn't go through it. Rashi says it's because we're afraid that they're osek in the burial of their close one, and they're going to become tamei. So there's no problem necessarily with onain, but they're going to become tamei. Our Mishnah goes through a little bit of a different detail. It says our Mishnah, onain, again, an onain is someone, the pure onain, someone whose close relative died during that day, so on Erev Pesach, tovel ve'ochel pischol le'erev. That onain can go to the mikvah during the day and eat the carbon Pesach at night. Now, why do they go to the mikvah is a whole different question, right? The person's not tamei, just to be clear. But there's a halacha that anyone who cannot eat kachim for whatever reason, let's say because they're an onain, is considered to be midrabanan tamei from eating kachim. It's a circular thing, essentially. If you can't do it, you're not careful about staying tahar. And therefore, the Rabbanan made a decree that anyone who can't eat kachim for whatever reason also has to go to the mikvah before they eat kachim. So basically, we treat them like it's full yom. So an onain should go to the mikvah and eat their carbon pesach that night, la'erev, avalo b'kachim. But they're not, on the night that they're an onain, allowed to eat kachim. I mean, they're still prohibited from kachim, but they're allowed to eat a carbon pesach. We'll see why in the Gemara. And remember, if we learned about another category of people who are like onanim, someone who hears about someone in their family who died, so they didn't know about it, might have happened a month ago or 6 months ago. The day the person hears about it, they have a status of a mourner, and so they're an onain. But that's only midrabanan. Or if you're malakit lo atzamot, now top line, if they gather, they move the bones, right, which is something that they used to do. I mean, we do it today still too, but they would bury someone, in a situation where they had to be buried, and then at some later point gather up the bones and bring them to Eretz Yisrael or bring them to another burial spot. That day, there's also takana of onein on the day midrabanan, but since it's only midrabanan, tovel v'ochel b'kachim. Both those people can also be tovel, and they can even eat kachim. They don't have to worry that night about kachim either. Continues the Mishnah. How about a ger? So a ger, the convert, and it's gayer be'erev Pesach, becomes, or he or she becomes Jewish, becomes a ger on erev Pesach. Says Beit Shammai omrim tovel v'ochel pischol erev. The ger should be tovel, and which is part of gerut, right? And then they can eat their karban Pesach that night, because we do midrabanan. We'll see why in the Gemara, we treat that ger like an onein, but well, like an onein. We treat the ger, let's see in the Gemara. We treat the ger with some level of tumah, but that night is fine. No, haparesh min ha'arla keparesh min ha'kever. A person who is paresh from the status of arla, and we'll see that this is not literally arla necessarily, but non-Jewishness, is like someone who was born from the grave, meaning, or paresh from the grave, meaning you treat them as if they are tamei mate, and they're for 7 days after their conversion, they can't eat the karban Pesach. So he's more machmir. Says the Gemara, my time. Now, what's the reason in the Tanna Kama says that an onein can eat karban Pesach at night? Because kasavra aninut delayla drabanan. This is the machloka we had in Zvachim, whether a person is onein, where Torah talks about aninut, but does it extend to the night? This Tana is Rabbi Shimon, I think, who says that aninut delayla is drabanan. So in HaTorah, a person only becomes an onein from the time of the day that they hear about the dead person, or that happened. Sorry, the person dies until that night. At night, it's only midrabanan. And Gabi Pesach lo hamidu devreim b'makom karet. Because Pesach is so important, something that if you don't do, your chayv karet, as we're going to discuss as well. The Chachamim did not apply their rule of aninut Gabi karet, b'makom karet. But Gabi kachim, by other karbanot, hamidu devreihem b'makom asay, where there's only a mitzvah asay to eat kachim, so it is a positive commandment, but it's not as stringent or as severe as Pesach. The Chachamim did not apply their words, their gzera. Hashamei mito. If a person hears about the dead, or the Mishnah said, if you're melakir atzamot, if you gather the bones, this is why if you're melakir atzamot, you're tamei, because you touched bones of a dead person. Melakir atzamot habai haza'ah shlishi v'shvi'i. That person, if they on erev Pesach they gathered up the bones and carried them to a new cemetery, they should have to go to the mikvah or get haza'ah shlishi and shvi'i. Ema, you're right. It means shaliktu lo atzamot, which is sort of what our Mishnah said, that someone did it for him. It's not that the person did it, someone else did it. Now, unfortunately, those people, I guess, can't eat the Pesach unless they're not Jewish, I guess. But he or she, the person whose mate it was, would be tamei like an onein, not tamei, would be usher like an onein, midra banan, but that doesn't extend to the night, and therefore they can eat a karban Pesach. Ger shenitz gayer. What about a convert? So Amar Rabba, Rabbi Chanan, Rabbi Yochanan, machloket ba'arel nachri. Although Beit Hillel said this terminology, which says haparesh min ha'arla is koparesh min ha'kever, it don't take that literally, because he did not mean that anyone who gets circumcision who was previously uncircumcised is treated like a person who's tamei mate, right? It's only true, says Rabbi Baruch Hana, by arel nachri, by a non-Jew who's converting. The Beit Hillel Savri, Beit Hillel says, look, gzeira shema yitama l'shana haba. We're worried. Remember, the halacha, a ger shenit gayer, is we say like they were born. A person could be a ger. They were non-Jewish. They were tamei directly. They were working with dead bodies all day long. They go to the mikvah and become a ger. They're tahar right away. There's no 7 days of tumah. They're a brand new person, right? However, the problem is, we're afraid that the ger might not realize that nuance. And so one year before he converts, he's tamei mate. He goes to the conversion court the next day. He dips in. He gets circumcised. He's a convert. He can eat the karban Pesach that night, according to Beis Shammai and according to the halacha. But we're afraid that the next year, when he's a Jew, he's going to say, "Well, last year I was tamei mate, right? I was doing my regular job, working in the morgue, and I just went out the next day, went to the mikvah, and I was fine." So we're afraid, says Beit Hillel, he'll say the Shema Yitama l'Shana Haba. The next year he'll become tamei before Pesach. The Yomar, and he'll say to himself, Ishtaked, last year when I was not Jewish yet, Nilo Tavalti v'achalti. Erev Pesach, I went into the mikvah and I ate the karban Pesach. Achshav nami et v'ochel. So let me do the same thing this year. And B'lo yada, and of course he didn't recognize he was non-Jewish, and lo makabel tuma. The fact that he was touching things did not make him tameh. So once he converted, he was okay. But Achshav Yisrael makabel tuma. Now he's a Jew for everything, and he's makabel tuma, and therefore he'd have to wait 7 days and have haza'ah shlishi and shvi'i, and we're afraid that he'll make that mistake. And so therefore, we basically made a takana that every ger should be treated like someone who has recently touched mate and should go through 7 days of tahara, according to Beit Hillel. Okay, and Beit Shammai Savri lo gazrina. Beit Shammai says, this seems very far-fetched. People will figure out the difference. Aval Arel Yisrael, but if he was a Jew who, for whatever reason, didn't have a brit milah, right? Either health reasons or maybe there was no moel or whatever, and he's 25 years old and he gets a brit milah on Erev Pesach because he wants to eat the korban Pesach, right? Divrei hakol tovel v'ochel pischol ha'erev. Everybody agrees, even Beit Hillel, that you can eat the korban Pesach that night because there's no tumah involved, right? You just did what you're supposed to do. V'lo gazrinan arel Yisrael mishum arel nachri. We wouldn't make a secondary gzera to the other gzera. Right, the Nachri goes there because of when he was non-Jewish. We're not going to be gozer and Arel Yisrael from Arel Nachri. And Tainami Hachi, in fact, the Braita says this out clearly. Amar Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Reb Shimon ben Elazar Zatana said, "Lo nechleku Beit Shammai Beit Hillel al Arel Yisrael shetovav achad piskol erev." Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel don't disagree about a Arel Yisrael who was, for whatever. Remember, you can't have a Karm Pesach, of course, if you're an Arel. So let's say, the person either didn't know, they live far away, but finally they come to do the Pesach. They can be tovel, they can be mal on Erev Pesach, and then go to the mikvah, and then go eat their korban Pesach that night. But amanechliku al arel nachri. They argue about an arel who's converting. Shebeit Shammai omrim tovel v'chel piskol erev. It doesn't. You go to the mikvah, you're fine. You're Jewish for all purposes. Beit Hillel omrim, it's true. You're Jewish for all purposes, but a pareshim ha'arla kipareshim ha'kever. A person who is, separated from Arla, meaning becoming Jewish in this case, not the circumcision, is like someone who's Paresh Min HaKever, and they'd have to treat it like Tumah and have to wait 7 days. Okay? Says the Gemara Marava, when you want to make a list of these things, sometimes, and even in our Mishnah you can see, there are times where there's a Gzera Midrabanan that pushes off an Isser Doraita. Right? We don't allow you to do something midoraita because of Gzera midrabanan. For example, Beit Hillel with a ger, right? Because the ger, for all purposes, is Jewish. Beit Hillel says, well, we're worried about next year and this and that, so don't do your korban Pesach. Right? That's a pretty big thing. And we have times the Chachamim make a takana, but they walk it back in the setting of korban Pesach. And the example in our Mishnah was the onain, right? So normally in onain, we don't allow that person to, there's aninut laila midrabanan, the night afterwards you're an onain and you can't eat kachim midrabanan, but they said we don't make that takana when it's a korban Pesach because it's a isser of karet. So what are these things? So says Rava, I'll give you a list. It doesn't give you a reason, but it gives you a list. Says Rava, Arel, Haza'ah, and Izmo, these 3 cases, we'll go through each one of them. In all of these cases, Hamidu Divreihem b'makom karet. The Chachamim were strong to their words, even b'makom karet, meaning they said, even though it's a gzera midrabanan, it will stop you from doing korban Pesach or something that's karet. Onein umitzora beit pras. These 3 cases, lo hamidu devreim b'makom karet. Now we'll go through all 6 cases. Arel, first case is a uncircumcised person. Hadamar. That was our Mishnah, which basically Beit Hillel said, if you're a convert, really the point is not Arel, the point is convert, right? But an Arel who's a convert, according to Beit Hillel, even though he's really able to eat the korban Pesach at night, they made a gzera, and the gzera was that maybe next year you'll forget and you'll become, etc. And therefore they stopped you from eating the korban Pesach. So if you convert within 7 days of Pesach, you can't eat the korban Pesach. Okay, midrabanan. That's one case, Arel. Haza'ah. What's haza'ah? Remember, haza'ah is sprinkling the blood, right, on someone who is a tamei mate. But the Gemara says, the Amar Mar, we learned, haza'ah shvut, the act of doing haza'ah is considered a shvut. It's considered a shvut, the Gemara said in Shabbos, because it's tikkun mana. You're basically fixing a person. You're taking a person who's tamei mate, and by sprinkling on them, you're making them tahar. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos, though it's a shvut. The Torah doesn't say that, obviously. And eino dochet the Shabbat. And so it turns out, which would have huge implications, right? Let's say the Shabbat was the day Erev Pesach, like this year, right? And everyone who was Tameh, their 7th day turned out, whatever, all the people who became Tameh on Sunday, their 7th day was Shabbat. none of them can get haza'ah on Shabbat, and therefore none of them can bring the Karban Pesach, right? Which in any given year is probably many people. But even though it's a drabanan, they were mamid divrehem, they kept their words in b'makom, even though it was makom karet. And the third case is ismol. Ismol is usually the knife or the sharp edge that you use for brit milah. Remember, if a person doesn't have a brit milah, or if someone in your household doesn't have a brit milah, you're not allowed to bring the Karban Pesach. So let's say one of your slaves or one of your children or yourself don't have a brit milah, and it's maybe this year, it's Shabbat Erev Pesach, you want to circumcise, but you don't have a knife, right? So you can't bring a knife through the street. That's an Isser Doraita. So there's ways to carry a knife midrabanan. You can go through a carmelit, or you can go through a roof. So says the Gemara, the Braita, the Tanya, just like you can't carry a knife to do brit milah through a public area, because that's an Isser Doraita, you also can't carry a knife that way, in which case you can't do the Brit Milah and you can't bring the Karban Pesach. And so again, it's another example where even though it's resulted from an Isser Drabanan, the Rabbanan were strong. I mean, they held up their words even though it was Makom Kareh. Those are three examples where they did do it. What are the three examples where they didn't do it? They are Onain, right? First one is Onain, which is Hadamar, and that was our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said that really a person whose relative died is an Onain that day. Aninut of that day is Doraita. It extends to the next night, Midrabanan. The Rabbanan said, don't worry about that with Pesach. Bring your Karban Pesach, even though you're an Onain Midrabanan. Okay? So that's
even if the person was buried? No.
It's a good question. So there's, it's a good question.
So somebody died on Wednesday, okay? So you're talking about Thursday night, right? If the person, right?
Wednesday night.
The same day that the person died.
Correct. Aninut applies the day the person died for that whole day.
Okay.
Okay,
So the night is the next day or something.
The night is the next day, correct.
Right.
The
But
question,
until the person is buried?
no. So that's a different. I'm saying, forget about burial for a second. If a person's not buried, it applies that day midoraita. Beyond that day midrabanan. Once a person's buried, it presumably does not apply.
Right.
There's a little bit of a different halacha of not doing a carbon also the day that someone's buried, but that's a little bit of a different halacha. We talked about it in Zvachim, right? So, but here we're talking about where the person died on Erev Pesach.
Okay.
This was actually a Gemara we had a very long sugi at the end of Pesachim. There was a whole debate, if you recall, maybe you don't recall, but in the end of Pesachim about when the person died.
And Pesachim or Shabbat?
Sorry?
And Pesachim, we haven't gotten
Zvachim.
Zvachim.
Because if the person died after Chatzot, the Gemara, there's a machloket Tanaim about this, what happened. But either way, once you bury them, presumably you're not onain anymore. There's a slightly different halacha that the day of burial, you also are treated like an onain, just same way like the day of the bones being gathered, you're treated like an onain for that day, and you can't bring kudshim that whole day, the day of burial.
Right.
That doesn't go to the night afterwards, right?
Okay.
So again, I just want to be clear. You're thinking of a couple things about onain. There's one halacha of onain, which is that you can't eat a carbon and you can't bring a carbon. You can't eat maaser, for example, when you're an onain, when a person's an onain.
Right.
There's a whole separate halacha, which is related, that a person's not chayv in mitzvot when they're an onain, right? Which is the one we're more comfortable with. Those are not exactly the same thing. They're related, of course, but the reason they're not exactly the same thing, Tosis points out on the bet, but we talked yesterday also, is that one of the reasons you're not chayv in mitzvot is because of tirda, right? It's because you're occupied with both your grief, but also the responsibility to bury that person.
Right.
So that's a specific, and once the burial happens, or there's a whole halacha about this. If you hire someone else to do the burial, right, and or you have other people in the family, does it apply, right? There's a whole question on inut when you're not there, right? Because you're not being oseg.
Right.
But that's what we obviously, unfortunately, in our lives has an implication.
Right.
This halacha is related, but it's a separate halacha of kudshim, that there's a specific mitzvah, lo achalti ba'onim imenu, right? You're not allowed to eat, that's by maaser. You can't eat maaser when you're an onain. And there's a halacha, of course, by the children of Aaron, that they were not allowed to bring kudshim when Aaron's sons died. And that's where we derive all these rules from. So they're related, but they're not exactly the same.
Aninut Laila would only be for that night. The next day, they're fine.
So that's another good question. So it's possible that Aninut Laila Midrabanan extends until the burial. meaning
Oh.
that the next day, let's say the person hasn't been buried yet, there's
Right.
still aninut, but it's only midrabanan like aninut laila.
Okay. All right.
But so that aninut midoraita is aninut yom does not mean day, it means that day. And then
Right.
beyond that becomes drabanan.
Okay.
Okay,
Right.
but our sugya is not avelut, so we'll have other places to expand on that. But anyways, continues the that's onain. Mitzora mahi. What's the case of mitzora? The Tanya mitzora shechal shmini shelo be'erev Pesach. Right. Let's say a mitzora. Remember, a mitzora, as everyone recalls from the Pesachim, which I guess we'll have soon enough, becomes tamei for 8 days. Well, not tamei; they become tamei for a long time. But once they're tahar, they wait 8 days. They bring their karban. They go to the mikvah, and their hair shemesh on the 7th day. On the 8th day, they bring their karban and they get the blood put on their earlobes and their toe, and then they're tahar on the 8th day. So let's say you have a mitzora, and the 8th day of them is Erev Pesach. So that presumably what they would do is they would go to the Beit HaMikdash, they would bring their karban, they would become tahar, and they'd bring the karban Pesach and be fine, right? But however, the person was ra'ah keri bo bayom. The person became a bal keri. If you recall that a bal keri is a halacha we're going to see in a second is midrabanan, that a bal keri has to be yotzei milamachana leviyah. That a bal keri can't go within the azara. They can't go into, well, not even the azara, the Ezrat Nashim even, right? They can't go into the machane leviyah. And so if a bal keri can't go in midrabanan, how can they go and get the blood sprinkled on their ear? They can't become tahar. They have to physically be there, right? So if they become a bal keri, says the Mishnah, the Braita, tovel ve'ochel. They can be tovel. I think there should be more words here. And they can eat the karban Pesach that night, meaning they can also go into the Beit HaMikdash and they can get the procedure done. Because Amru Chachamim, Afal Pishet Tful Yom Eino Nichnas, even though usually a person who's Tful Yom, meaning they went to the mikveh that day and they become tahar at night, they couldn't go into the Machane Leviyah. This one, Zen Yit Nichnas, this person who's both a mitzora on their 8th day, who needs to go in to get the blood sprinkled on their ear, and is also its full yom, should go in, because mutav yavo asay sheyesh bo karet, that you'd rather have the asay of karban Pesach, which ultimately will have karet, the yidcha asay she'en bo karet, and push off the prohibition of not going into the Beit HaMikdash as a balkari, which is not karet. And says the Gemara, before you get comfortable with that, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, it's not even an asay. Dvar Torah afilo asay in bo. It's only midrabanan. It's not a real mitzvah asay, meaning it's not a doraita that a person who's a balkari or a Tful Yom cannot go into the Beit HaMikdash. Shenemer, because it's based on the following verse. The pasuk says, "Vayamod." This is in Divrei Yamim. Vayamod Yehoshaphat b'kal Yehuda v'Yushalayim. Yehoshaphat, King Yehoshaphat, right? So we're talking first Beit HaMikdash. Yehoshaphat stood among the crowd of Yehuda and Yushalayim, Beit Hashem, lifnei chatzar chadasha, in front of the new chatzar. What do you mean chatzar chadasha? What was new about it, right? They were standing in the Beit HaMikdash. It was Shlomo made it hundreds of years before. So my chatzar chadasha. So the Gemara learned shechidshu bo davar. It's a chatzar chadasha that they made a chadasha in halacha. They made a new rule where they basically expanded the kedusha of the Beit HaMikdash. The Amru, what they said, and this is a gzera, Tful Yom lo yikanes b'machane leviyah. That a Tful Yom should not go into the machane leviyah, meaning into the Harabayit, into the whole area around the Beit HaMikdash. And that was Yoshaphat was very early, but it was a very early, but only Takanat Drabanan. And in a case where a person's a mitzora on their 8th day and they need to go in order to get the blood sprinkled on their earlobe, they are allowed to go in, even though they're a balkari who is tovel and is a tful yom. Okay. The final case was Beit HaPras. Beit HaPras means, remember, a place where pras literally, I guess, literally means ground, right, or pressed. So a place where there was a grave, known to be a grave, a dead body, and the area was plowed over. So there was a marker that so and so is buried here. You come back 2 years later, and the marker's gone, and the place is all worked up. So you know that the bones of that person or people are spread throughout the field. And so now, the question is, of course, there are no big ones, but there might be very small bone fragments. And so a person will become tamei if they touch those. So what do you do? So says the Braita, Beit HaPras, it's a Mishnah, it's not. Shavin Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel, both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel will agree, says the Mishnah, Shebodkin Lo'osei Pesach, that you are allowed to be bodek and clear out a Beit HaPras for people who need to go do the Karban Pesach, right? Let's say the only way to get from my house to the highway is through this Beit HaPras or whatever, and I want to go do a Karban Pesach, but I can't be Tamei Mate. So you can be Bodek. You can check the field. Checking probably means you could, well, we'll see how checking means actually. Ve'ein bodkin l'ochlei truma, but you don't check for people who need to eat truma. You should just wait a little bit, let's say. My bodkin, now what does bodkin mean for Pesach? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, minafeach beit hapras v'holech. You can blow, right? You get a bellows and you push off, you blow the top layer of soil so that anything that's movable would be moved out of the way. And so you can be comfortable that whatever that dirt and stuff is and pebbles and maybe bone fragments is something that you're not directly touching. All you're touching is the ground below it. Or Rabbi Yehuda bar Abaye Mishmei de Rabbi Yehuda Amar Beit HaPras Nidash Tahor. Sorry, it's a different halacha is that a Beit HaPras that was Nidash means it was dash, right? People made a path on it. So it was stepped on and pushed down. So as long as there's a path, you can be comfortable that either all the bones or parts would be pushed into the ground, right? And so you're not directly going to touch them, or they've been pushed to the side. But that would be okay. However, that's only true by Karban Pesach. In general, a Beit HaPras would be usher to walk on because you're assuming you're becoming Tamei Mate. But by Pesach, they were lo himidu divrayim, and they allowed you to walk on the Beit HaPras with these strategies. And so this is an example where the Chachamim were not himidu divrayim b'makom karet. Hadran alach ha'isha. Okay, next Mishnah, next parak. We're almost here, right? We're just at the end of what we call, before we get to Arei Pesachim, the final halacha, which of course we've been waiting for our whole time, is Pesach Sheni, right? Who, when, what, how? Hanan's been asking questions since we started. What's the category? Who does Pesach Sheni? We've actually obviously discussed it in many instances already, but now come the Mishnayot to make it very formal. The pasuk, of course, says that a person who's tamei or b'derech rechoka and can't do Karban Pesach Rishon brings Pesach Sheni. So says the Mishnah, Mishahaya tamei or b'derech rechoka. Let's say a person is either tamei, presumably we're not sure what kind of tumah, right? The easiest example is tamei mate, right? And remember we talked about which day of tamei mate, right? If you're tamei mate b'shvi'i shelo, then you could be tahor that night, so that might be the case. Or it's tamei mate b'shishi shelo is what we talked about, which means before 7, right? So you can't become tahor that night. We talked before about tumah sheretz, but it says our Mishnah, Mishahaya tamei o b'derech rechoka v'lo asa tarishon, which sounds very strange. When he couldn't do the first one, right? But he doesn't do, or she doesn't do Pesach Rishon. Yaseh Sheni, that person should do Pesach Sheni. Now, if a person is shagag or ne'enas, a person is shogeg, right? Well, I'm not sure. Well, ones is easy, right? You forgot it was Pesach or whatever. You were sick, let's say, right? Ne'enas. Shogeg is maybe you forgot the date. You went to Yerushalayim and you slept late and you didn't realize it was Erev Pesach, right? It can happen to all of us. So you're shogeg. I would call that a shogeg, but some people might call it an ones. Either way, you don't. It's not for a good reason. It's just that it's not for a mate or a derech rechoka. But you didn't do Karban Pesach Rishon. Lo asata Rishon, says the Mishnah, Yaseh Sheni. You also can do Pesach Sheni. Okay? In Cain, says the Mishnah, Lama Nemar Tameo Oshayi B'derech Rechoka. So why does the Torah speak out someone who's Tameo B'derech Rechoka? Why doesn't it just say, no, this is the way I would read it. It's not the right way, but why doesn't it just say anyone who doesn't do Pesach Rishon? So the reason it said Tameo B'derech Rechoka is to tell you, She'elu P'turini Karet, that these are Patur from Karet, but Elu are Chayavim B'Karet. The other people are Chayav B'Karet. Now, it seems like that means if you don't do it B'Shogeg or Ones, you're Chayav Karet, which seems pretty outrageous, right? How could you be Chayav Karet if you were Ones? So Rashi explains, which the Gemara does too, that this is not referring to Shogeg and Ones. This is saying, the Torah said, Tamei and Derech Rechoka, to give you people who have a legitimate excuse. If you don't do the Pesach and you have no excuse, you're a 5th category, which is Mazed, right? Which our Mishnah hasn't mentioned yet. You're someone who just doesn't feel like it. You're living there, you're able to do it, you just are like, I don't feel like doing it today, or I'm too busy, or it's too many crowds, whatever the reason. That's where you're Chayiv Karet. When you have an excuse, you're not Chayiv Karet. Okay? Itmar. Now, what about, as our Braita, the Gemara actually, what about the case, what does Derech Rechoka mean? What does that mean you live far away? So let's say you're Haya B'derech Rechoka. Let's say you are far away, meaning you're outside of the Chomat Beit Pagi, outside of the walls of Yerushalayim at the time that they're shechting the Karban Pesach. But you're on your way. right? Your flight's arriving very late in the afternoon. And so you ask your friend, make a shliach or your family to shech the carbon pesach for you. And you pull up to the gates of your hotel, right at Shkia time, and you're there for the Seder. So what if you are b'derech rechuka, but you make it and there's shachtu v'zarku alav, they shech the carbon pesach for you, even though you're not there, and you make it for the Seder. Can you then eat that carbon pesach? So Rav Nachman Amar Hortza. Rav Nachman says it works for you. Okay, it's okay. It works for you because at the time that they shechted, although you were derech rechoka, the fact is you were able to make it, and that's fine. And Rav Sheshet Amar Lo Hortza. No, it doesn't work. Your person who's not there cannot have a carbon pesach brought for them. Okay, which is a fashion halacha. So just remember this, right? Nowadays, once we have a Beit HaMikdash, we bring carbon pesach. You can't go to work and be in, Tel Aviv during the day and have them bring carbon pesach for you. You got to actually be, according to Rav Sheshet, in the space where you're able to bring the carbon pesach within the realm of Yerushalayim, right? And that's how we paskin. But that's Rav Sheshet's opinion. Rav Nachman says, I disagree. Hortza. Why? Because when the Torah says that if you're far away, you bring Pesach Sheni, it's not saying you have to bring a Pesach Sheni. It's saying you can bring a Pesach Sheni. Meichas hu dechasra chamana alav. The Torah is having compassion on you that you weren't close enough to do it, so we have a way for you to do it even with Pesach Sheni. But if you make it because you have someone do it for you and you make it at night, tavo lav bracha, then you're fine. Then it's a good thing that you did. So then tavo lav bracha. Okay. Where am I? That's Rav Sheshet, sorry. And that's Rav Nachman, sorry. Rav Sheshet Amar Lo Hortza, that it doesn't work because Midcha Dechia Rachmana Kitameh. The Torah pushed you off like a Tameh. Just like a person who's Tameh obviously cannot bring the carbon Pesach if they want to, and if it's shechted for him, he's not okay, right? It's not okay. He's not Yotzei. The same thing is true about Derech Rechoka. If you are not close or within the space, again, we're going to discuss later how far away is Derech Rechoka. But if you're not close enough during the time of the shechita, it doesn't matter that you got there in time to eat it. You're not yotzei your carbon. You've got to do Pesach Sheni. Okay. Now says Rav Nachman, Mina Minallah. How do I know that I'm right? That you can be yotzei a Pesach Rishon even if you're derech rechoka, as long as someone does it for you and you make it at night. How do I know that? It's not, because if you look at our Mishnah, what does our Mishnah say? Mishahaya tamei or b'derech rechoka. A person who is tamei or far away, the lo asa tarishon yaseh tasheni, and he doesn't do the first one, he should do the second one. What do you mean? And he doesn't do the first one? He can't do the first one, right? Even if he did the first one, he would have to do the second one according to you, because according to Rav Nachman, sorry, Rav Sheshet, I keep mixing them up. According to Rav Sheshet, you're not yotzei even if you do it, right? So when our Mishnah says the lo asa michlal di ba'yavad, it makes it sound like if you wanted to, you could have done it, but if you didn't do it, you do Pesach Sheni, which implies that even though you're far away, you can get a messenger and phone it in. Wait 1 second. I agree with you. The Mishnah sounds like that, but you have to question that reading of the Mishnah, because ihachi, look at the Seifa. The next case in the Mishnah is the Ketani Shagag Onenas. Right, the person has a shogeg, he has an accident or an ones or an accident. He doesn't bring the carbon pesach. The lo asat rishon yaset hasheni, and he doesn't do the first one. He can do the second one. Right, now it's the same exact words. Right, so what do you think it means there? That he's an ones and he didn't do it. If you're an ones, by definition, you can't do it. That's what ones means. Right, you were sick, you were in the hospital, you were whatever. Nidiktani v'lo asa michlal dibay avan rishagag hare ones. The whole point is that he's shogeg or ones. What does it mean? It must be that when our Mishnah says v'lo asa, it's actually referencing the fifth case that we didn't mention in the Mishnah, the case of Mezid, right? It's saying, and if he Ella, it must be Mezid Katani Bahadayim. It must be saying Mezid with them, meaning it's saying, again, we're going to get into this in much more detail, but it must be saying that there are three cases. There's a shogeg, there's an ones, and there's a person who just didn't do it, because they didn't feel like doing it. That person can do Pesach Sheni. Now this implies, and again, we're going to get into this tomorrow and the next days, that a person who's a Mezid can do a Pesach Sheni, right? That if a person who just said, I don't feel like doing carbon Pesach, it's too crowded, I'm going to wait for, when the crowds go away, that person can do Pesach Sheni. we're going to see a whole discussion about this because the Torah does not make it sound like that at all, right?
Of course,
But
if everybody says that, it's going to be crowded on Pesach Sheni.
that's what happens, right? So may as well go to the first one. But just to remember, we said, if you recall, we said earlier there were 3 kitot for Pesach, and that they never really had the third one because everyone rushed to do the first 2. It's like the vaccine, right? Everyone was rushing to get in. So hopefully there weren't a lot of people like that. But in any event, that's what the Mishnah must mean. Again, we'll discuss it more. Says Rav Sheshet, since you have to add something to the second case of the Mishnah, right? It must be Mezid Katani Bahadayo, Hachanami Onein Katani Bahadayo. I would add onein in the first part. So when the first part of the Mishnah said a person who's tamei or derech rechoka and doesn't do the carbon pesach, it doesn't mean the derech rechoka didn't do it. It means a third case now, which would be an onein. Remember, we said an onein does not have to do, well, an onein can do a carbon pesach, right? They have to do carbon pesach because at night there's no aninut. There's no aninut laila. Right? So the Mishnah is saying if they didn't, they could do a Pesach Sheni because they're similar to a Tamei or Derech Rechoka. This is what Tosfos says because they're very occupied with, all the taking care of their mourning and their grief and the mate. And so in many ways, they're not present. They're like a Derech Rechoka. He doesn't say that, but something like that. Amar Rav Ashi, says Rav Ashi, in fact, I have support from the Mishnah for my opinion that Matnita Nami Deka, sorry, I have support for this opinion, that Matnita Nami Deka, the Mishnah in fact makes it sound like that. The Ketani, the Mishnah says, Elu Peturim Mihi Karet. Like the last words of the Mishnah were, why did the Torah then say Tamei Derech Rechoka? It's to tell you that these are Patur from Karet, the Elu Chayavim Mihi Karet. And these are Chayav Karet. Now, who's Chayav Karet? Right? Who mentioned in our Mishnah would be Chayav Karet for missing the carbon pesach? Ilema shogeg v'nenas, they're not chayav karet. Shogeg v'nenas b'nei kares ninu, right? If you are shogeg, you're wrong, but you don't get karet unless you do b'mezid. Elalav amezid v'onein. It must be. It's referring to mezid and onein, which are these cases that we are adding to the Mishnah, right? So basically, there are unstated cases in the Mishnah, and those unstated cases are said by the words lo asa, which implies you didn't do it, meaning you could have done it. And you didn't do it. So in the Reisha, that's an onein who's not tamei. He's worried he'll become tamei, but he's not tamei. And in the Seifa, it's a mezid who just doesn't feel like doing it. Both of those people, if they don't do it, they can do Pesach Sheni, but they are chayiv karet. Now, again, we'll see in the Gemara as we go forward, what does that mean they're chayiv karet? Are they chayiv karet now because they didn't do it? Or are they chayiv karet if they don't do Pesach Sheni, right? So we'll get to that as we go on. Who's chayiv karet? Rav Nachman would say to you, 5 lines from the bottom, L'olam amezid l'chudayu. Then in fact, no, there's no case of onein. It's referring to mezid. Ubedinu dibayle lemitni chayav. The Mishnah should have said the word chayav. L'hai dektani chayavin. I did tana reisha piturin tana sefer chayavin. That in fact the word elu chayavin b'hikaret is referring just to a mezid and not a onein. And the reason we say chayavin, which is plural, is because the reisha said piturin. But it doesn't mean that there's another case necessarily in the Mishnah. That's Rav Nachman's opinion, that a person who's derech rechoka, who can appoint a shliach and get there at night, is okay, is allowed to bring carbon pesach. If they do it, they're yotzei, and they don't do pesach sheni. Rav Sheshet's opinion was that not true, that if you are derech rechoka, even if you can get there at night, you cannot bring a carbon pesach. Amar Rav Sheshet minna minallah. How do I know that? The Tanya, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Nemar Tamei, Nemar B'derech Rechoka. Says Rabbi Akiva in the Braita, the Torah specifically says 2 categories: a person who's tamei and a person who's far away. And what does that tell you? Ma tamei, just like a tamei is someone who's sipek biyado lasot, right? A tamei is a person who has all the physical capability to bring carbon pesach. They're sitting at home, sitting shiva, whatever. Right, and they are able to walk into the Beit HaMikdash and do carbon pesach. They can't because they're tamei, but they have the physical ability to do it. But Eino said they're not allowed to do it because the Torah says you're not allowed to do it. Right? Af derech rechoka nami. Also, when the Torah says a person is far away, it includes also a person who's sipek biyado lasot ve'eino oseh. He's a person who could do it but does not do it. How could that be? It must be this case of Rav Sheshet, where he's derech or rechoka during the time of the shechita, but he will be able to get there to eat it. in which case you could maybe appoint a shliach to do it for you. And if you do that, you'll have a good carbon Pesach. Says Rabbi Akiva in the Braita, you can't do that. You're just like a tamei who physically can do it, but halachically can't do it. The same is true about a person who's derech rechuka. The Rav Nachman Amar Lecha. Now Rav Nachman has to admit that this Braita says Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, that a person who's derech rechuka cannot bring a carbon Pesach. So how does Rav Nachman explain that? Rav Nachman says, so you're right, Rabbi Akiva disagrees with me, but I'm going according to our Mishnah. And Rabbi Akiva is l'tamei. That's the opinion Rabbi Akiva has said elsewhere, which is a dat yachid, the kasavar ein shochtin v'zorkin al tamei sharetz. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that you can't do a carbon Pesach if you're tamei sharetz. Remember, tamei sharetz can go to the mikvah and be tahar at night. And so in theory, it's the same thing as a derech rechuka who's not there. A person is tamei now, I can't bring the carbon Pesach, but add me to the list for your carbon. I went to the mikvah. Tonight I'll be tahar. I'll join you for the Seder. Says Rabbi Akiva, that's not okay. Since you're tamei at the time of the hakrava, of the shechita, you can't bring a carbon Pesach. If that's the case, then I understand. All tuma is not doable, and derech rechuka is not doable. But according to everyone else, anas svirale, meaning Rav Nachman and Pesach, is kimanda amar shuchtin v'zarkin al tamei sharetz. Then in fact, you can do shechita on a person who's tamei sharetz, and they can eat the carbon Pesach that night, and therefore a person who's derech rechuka is just like a tamei sharetz. Right now, they can't do it. Now, this person, because he's physically not there, but will be able to partake later on. And therefore, just like a person who's tamei sharetz can bring a carbon Pesach, I maintain, says Rav Nachman, that there's a Tana who would maintain that a person who's derech rechuka can also bring the carbon Pesach. Great. So we did that. I know it was a little quick, but so I got to go to the hospital. So, and it looks like Dov is on, and Dov knows exactly where we are. 5 lines from the top at Tanur Rabbanan, but we'll get into all these questions of who brings Pesach Sheni and who's Chayav Karet, and it's gonna be a very exciting parak. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. Shavua Tov.